So, good afternoon, everybody from lockdown on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in beautiful Canberra. Welcome to the Fenner Seminar. My name's Jamie Pittock. I'm a professor at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. And more importantly, I've had the pleasure of being a supervisor of Melanie Pill's PhD research over the last 4 years. Melanie has done a splendid job in her work that looks at the disparities of the geopolitics of climate change, loss and damage within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so we're looking forward to her presentation on financing loss and damage from climate change in small island developing states. Melanie's going to talk for around 40 minutes, and then we should have time for discussion, about 20 minutes for discussion. If you have questions for her, please feel free to write them into the chat function. And we'll look forward to that discussion after the presentation. In the meantime, over to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you for introducing me. I'm going to miss this in the future. All right, so before we start, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. And for our international audience, this is something that's customary in Australia before we undertake any public speaking, to remember the traditional and rightful custodians of the land. So herewith, I acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from country that was stolen and belongs to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, also known as Canberra. I acknowledge that sovereignty has never ceded. I pay my respect to all elders, past, present, and emerging, and welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as other Indigenous nations that are watching here today. All right, well, let's get started. Jamie already mentioned that I'll be talking to you today on financing loss and damage from climate change in small island developing states. And I just wanted to say that I had the pleasure of having Professor Jamie Pittock as my supervisor, as well as Professor Mark Howden and Dr. Coco Warner. That's just a very quick outline of what I'll be talking to you today. So we'll have an introduction, presenting my research gap and the questions, then how I approached of responding to those questions and my methodology. And then I'm going to present my thesis chapters and the publications that they accompany. I draw a conclusion and present some limitations and areas for further research. So first, I do have to, unfortunately, give you a little bit of background, but that will set the scene for the thesis and basically give you an idea of how I came up with the research questions. So throughout the history and establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, loss and damage has always been quite a sensitive and politicized issue. So it actually started before the establishment of the UNFCCC in 1991, where a submission was made to the International Negotiating Committee to include loss and damage and its finance in the convention text. However, this submission was dismissed, and the next major noteworthy milestone was not reached before 2013, when the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was established at COP19. And then we had another major breakthrough at COP21 with the famous Paris Agreement, where loss and damage was included in Article 8. And which recognizes the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. However, it had an accompanying decision text that excluded any basis for liability and compensation. So that was due to fears of compensation liability. So with this decision, finance for loss and damage was off the table. And in addition to that, this made the topic even more sensitive and contentious. And the latest relevant development is the inclusion of loss and damage in the Katowice climate package that sets out the rules and procedures how to operationalize the Paris Agreement. So there's really almost nothing out there that aims to address or finance loss and damage in its entirety or holistically. And on top of that, this is a highly politicized area in which it seems hard to find meaningful agreements for a way forward. So the lack of finance, the lack of finance and will to address loss and damage led me to 4 simple research questions. How can finances be mobilized? How can finances be administered? How can finance be distributed? And what actually needs to be financed when we talk about loss and damage? So I wanted to say that this thesis is trying to overcome the politicization that loss and damage has experienced over the years. So I've used principles of pragmatism. I looked at a very people-centered and focused approach. And I also tried to find areas where practitioners agree and not disagree. So that included also the use of already existing funding arrangements and architectures and those that were anonymously agreed upon in international negotiations by all countries. So this thesis aimed to be innovative and thought-provoking, deviating a little bit from the usual approaches of addressing loss and damage, as we somehow got stuck in the trickier questions and traditional approaches failed to respond to answer those to a large extent. So, and these are some of the loss and damage impacts that need to be financed or addressed. So I really like this infographic that was developed by the UNFCCC, and it nicely illustrates what types of loss and damage there are. And I'm just going through a few examples very quickly. So we divide between sudden and slow onset events. And some of the examples for slow onset events are sea level rise, desertification, what else do we have here? Salinization or glacial retreat. Then the extreme events are storm surges, tropical cyclones, we're all familiar with these, drought or floods, for example. And then we also divide between economic and non-economic losses. Economic losses are those that can be do have a monetary value, and we look at things like business operations, infrastructure, or property. But then we have also things that are intangible, and we can't really put a price tag on them, and they have to do with life, health, human mobility, loss of territory, but also looking at the environment and loss of biodiversity. So, I told you that this thesis will address all aspects of loss and damage, and my chapters will also show how I'm going to do that before I'll come up with one mechanism and distilling all the results into one overarching potential mechanism, how I think this could all work. So I started off looking at existing and potential finance options. This will be chapters 2 and 3. Then I moved on to looking at what requires finance, in terms of looked at planned relocation, slow onset events, and non-economic losses in the Pacific. And this stands in contrast to chapter 6, where we look at ad hoc relocation, sudden onset events, and non-economic losses in the Caribbean. Then chapter 7 looks at slow onset events by itself, just on their own. And in chapter 8, I'm going to present what practitioners believe a potential mechanism for loss and damage needs to look like, and where we have those areas of agreement and disagreement. So I used a grounded theory approach with qualitative research methods and combined a lot of data and with a wide number of methods for each chapter. And each chapter has at least a combination of 3 methods. So I used semi-structured interviews, one global data set, which consists of 43 interviews with loss and damage practitioners from all over the world. They were UNFCCC negotiators, country representatives, NGOs, and then I also have a national or regional data set with 26 interviews with residents in Dominica and Antigua and Barbuda for chapters 3, 5, and 8. I've used a case study approach as well. So chapters 3 and 5 and 4 as well looks at the Pacific region, whereas chapters 6 and 3 look at the Bahamas and Dominica and Antigua and Barbuda, as I mentioned before. I have also attended the last conference of the parties, the COPs, as well as all the biennial executive committee meetings or the EXCOM meetings of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, or the WIM, in 2018 up until 2021. Then I did a systematic literature review. I did expert elicitation and networking through the conferences, the events and negotiations that ended up in a lot of information exchange. And I've done opportunistic sampling and desktop analyses because the topic requires a lot of review also of grey literature, such as reports from the UNFCCC or working papers. So now we're going into chapter 2, which is also a publication on insurance schemes. So just here you can see the circled little pictures that were also in the infographic. You'll have them in each chapter so you know which parts of loss and damage this chapter addresses. So chapter 3 looks at the insurance schemes that are currently available to finance sudden onset events. And some of the results were that insurance schemes are necessary but unsuitable to address the entirety of loss and damage. And that's because they do not align with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and intergenerational equity. And insurance products do not take economic inequality or any kind of gender considerations into account. And it also does not allow for the inclusion of human mobility. So if insurance was to be pursued to address all aspects of loss and damage, it would require an overhaul and some innovative approaches. Then I looked at an existing fund, the Green Climate Fund, which is the most recent and the largest climate fund currently out there, and see whether we could include loss and damage in the Green Climate Fund. And so I analyzed the governing instrument and the initial investment framework of the Green Climate Fund, and the suggestion to use it was also made by my interviewees in the global data set. So it is actually possible to extend or expand the so-called thematic funding windows of the governing instrument, and loss and damage could be included in that. And the investment framework outlines the eligibility criteria, and if we adjust those, loss and damage would also be able to be included. It would be made possible through post-disaster applications, and we would have to adjust the application procedure. The usage of some of the features of the European Solidarity Fund would work. So this is an existing fund that also makes, provides payments to countries after sudden natural disasters, and it would also allow for payments that overcome the problem of compensation and attribution. So then, in order to test the idea of including loss and damage in the Green Climate Fund, I have developed for this application forms a method for calculating the payments and developed eligibility criteria and conditions for payment, and then written up a whole application for the Bahamas and the destruction that Hurricane Dorian caused in 2019. So this paper is currently under review and submitted to climate policy. Now going into part C, I'm looking at what requires financing. So in the first instance, I looked at planned relocation projects with a focus on the Pacific and associated non-economic losses. In this chapter, I identified the non-economic losses that can occur and developed a spectrum leading from planned relocation as an adaptation response to potential loss and damage. So the idea is that with each planned relocation project, non-economic losses should be kept to a minimum so that we don't have to address them in the first place. I have provided and developed a toolbox for actions and address non-economic losses occurring from planned relocation, as you can see in figure 2. So this would be, for example, a project that is more community driven is more an adaptation response, whereas if it is forced, people would suffer more loss and damage. And then chapter 5 builds on this toolbox, and it identifies that there is need for more qualitative research and specifically participatory approaches where individuals and communities decide on their own future pathways. So now chapter 6, I've already indicated that, stands in contrast to chapters 4 and 5 and focuses on ad hoc relocation in the Caribbean. So the aim was through semi-structured interviews in Dominica and Antigua and Barbuda to find out what people classify as their non-economic losses from sudden onset events. And I asked them after the devastating Category 5 hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, so just in that unprecedented, devastating hurricane season. And both islands were decimated, and the population of Barbuda was entirely evacuated to the neighboring island of Antigua. And the responses revealed some interesting results. So when comparing them to the existing categories of the UNFCCC, they don't match in every aspect. They are inaccurately captured and require expanding as well as renaming and reframing. So this is incredibly important because otherwise policy responses to non-economic losses in the future will be ineffective and inadequate. So going back to our infographic, first of all, the losses people described to me were not so much losses, but in many instances, actually impacts. So the loss that respondents felt had an impact on their life, which is what people described to me as their loss. Secondly, non-economic impacts were mentioned that are currently not captured. Some of them were criminal activity, political favoritism, lost education, or environmental grief. In the case of Barbuda, colonial history and decades of political dispute exacerbated those non-economic losses. And all of these are really impacts, but they were described as losses to me. So, and when interviews asked me how they would like to see some of their non-economic losses addressed, they would have liked to see long-term recovery. So that was one thing that really came out of those interviews. Also, programs for counseling, for example. So then another striking result was that especially men described to me their non-economic losses as what we classify as economic losses, such as loss of income or loss of fish traps, loss of vessels, loss of crops and equipment. So this is despite the fact that I rephrased my question several times and referred to non-economic in different ways. For example, something that's intangible or something that you can't get back. And the responses were the same. So the reason for that is because respondents said that, for example, if I had my fish traps back, I could help feed my neighbor, or I wouldn't stress out that much. So this was especially the case for men who might feel that they have to, the main responsibility to provide for the family. So economic and non-economic losses seemed inherently connected. So an economic loss, in some cases, leads to a non-economic impact. And this is the case when an impact affects your livelihood in a way that prevents you from functioning or living in the same manner as before. Therefore, a third category needs to be added that reflects the combination between an economic and a non-economic impact, which we can call a life function. And the word function actually appeared the first time in a working paper by Morrissey and Oliver Smith in an attempt to quantify non-economic losses. And again, we're not serious about gender here. Non-economic impacts need to be addressed differently for men and for women. And here's some of the measures that respondents said they would like to see to address their non-economic losses. So quite prominent was long-term recovery and swifter reconstruction, counseling programs, faith exercise programs, help with education fees, and compensation was considered inappropriate and not helpful. Then I moved on and looked at slow onset events as they have not been separately addressed in the previous chapters. Based on interview responses, I investigated whether funds from philanthropic organizations could be an option to finance loss and damage from slow onset events. The idea was that funds could be mobilized and do not have to be paid back, but are instead given on the principle of solidarity or altruism. And a systematic literature review revealed that philanthropic giving to climate change efforts is actually increasing. And philanthropy can play a major role in addressing slow onset events and associated non-economic losses. So philanthropic funds are an untapped resource, but distributed to climate change projects in a non-strategic way. So usually it's based on interests or on payback periods. But it could be streamlined to fund the impacts from climate change, induced loss and damage, as philanthropic giving has a charitable character and loss and damage would not have a payback. So the development of an engagement strategy with these organizations would be required to make strategic use of those funds. And by using a solidarity fund type architecture, like I mentioned, the European Union Solidarity Fund, it might be suitable to administer and distribute the finance to address loss and damage from slow onset events. However, there's also a significant research gap on financial figures on climate change spending from these organizations in general. So research would need to be done on how much money is out there and who's spending money on what type of projects. So now we move on to an international level. So we've looked at national and regional approaches so far. And for Chapter 8, I have conducted 43 interviews with global loss and damage practitioners, as I mentioned, and they were from the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, they were from the UNFCCC negotiators, government representatives from small island developing states, developing countries, NGOs, environmental private sectors, all of them working on loss and damage and having that as their area of expertise. And I simply asked them how they think funds should be mobilized, distributed, and administered. And I received a vast variety of responses with really good innovative ideas and intricacies and detail on how they believe a fund could work. But I still found that there were themes and areas of agreement between all those practitioners. And I tried to capture them in one overarching mechanism. And based on the responses, this is what it would or could look like. So as this architecture is based on mutual areas of agreement between loss and damage practitioners, there is a large potential to depoliticize loss and damage funding. First of all, the polluter pays principle should be applied in order to mobilize funds. That was something that really came through from all stakeholder categories, may it be developed or developing countries, NGOs, UNFCCC, negotiators or ExCom members. The polluter pays principle was very prominent. And that should be applied to private corporations and major polluting parties to the UNFCCC. Another avenue that was mentioned was, again, to tap into philanthropic organizations. And these funds should be either administered by the Green Climate Fund or looking at the Warsaw International Mechanism and the Executive Committee that also might be able to play a role. And then fund components should relate to disaster risk reduction, adaptation, resilience and preparedness in order to reduce loss and damage in the first place. So that was a very prominent mention by all stakeholders as well, that reduction of loss and damage in the first place through resilience building, adaptation and disaster risk reduction is a priority. Insurance also needs to stay in place as an immediate response, and finance needs to be made available for post-disaster recovery, possibly as a solidarity component. Again, compensation was considered impractical by the majority of developing countries and rejected by developed countries as well. All policy responses are gender sensitive, and it was also mentioned by interviewees that a gender sensitive approach is even a gender beneficial approach. So by empowering and women in the first instance, or making sure that women are independent or not made dependent on men, will reduce loss and damage significantly. So if we distill and synthesize all the results from chapters 2 to 8, we can come up with one holistic framework or architecture that finances all aspects of loss and damage and has a way of mobilizing funds, a way of distributing them, and to address loss and damage with an administrative arrangement. All right, sorry, that's not working. So first of all, like I said, we need the polluters pays principle and philanthropy to mobilize those funds, and the distribution should be sorry, there you go. So, and the GCF should be used to administer and distribute those funds with new selection criteria that were developed in chapter 3, as well as a new application procedure. And those funds should be used for recovery and rehabilitation, the redefined non-economic losses or non-economic impacts, as well as planned relocation projects. And then we exclude insurance. It should remain standalone. We will also exclude compensation because it was apparent that in both data sets that compensation is not considered practical or desirable. And the adaptation component or the disaster risk reduction component is already included in the Green Climate Fund and is covered under the funding stream for adaptation. Then a PhD, of course, doesn't come without its challenges and limitations. For example, for chapter 4 on planned relocation, I was unable to undertake in-person fieldwork in the Pacific as planned, and therefore the chapter built on a desktop approach and review of existing literature in that particular field. It is also common, or sometimes it was hard to expand the pool of interviewees as well as ensuring that there is an equal spread between gender, industry, country, and the like. I received also very unexpected responses that made me rethink the way I tackled my research questions, particularly for Chapter 6 on ad hoc relocation and non-economic losses. Then obviously the geographical focus area had to be reduced, but it was quite interesting to see that interview responses were given quite generically on loss and damage. So even though I spoke to representatives from small island developing states, I always, not always, but often I received a very generic response on loss and damage. And then just to mention what is out of scope, because this thesis is based on qualitative research methods, there was no intention of calculating the attribution of loss and damage to climate change or quantifying any loss and damage into monetary figures. Some areas for further research internationally, so looking at what at the role of the executive committee of the Warsha International Mechanism. Will it remain a mechanism to enhance the understanding of loss and damage and provide guidelines, or will it maybe be more hands-on? What about we need to look at the Santiago network of loss and damage, how it's going to be negotiated at COP26. Then we should look at an attempt to engage with philanthropic organization as a funding stream. And we need to clarify what the polluter pays principle needs to look like. And that could possibly tie into the negotiations at COP26 in October, November, and how that could play out in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that deals with finance. On a national level, we need to include loss and damage in countries' national climate change strategies and their national determined contributions. And we need to start mapping out particular loss and damage needs in countries to account for their context dependency, because loss and damage looks different in a different context and in different countries. So yeah, so that's I'm at the end of my presentation, and I just wanted to acknowledge a few people that really have helped me through this journey, and there are just so many people that I'm grateful for and thankful for, and I really can't believe that this journey is coming to an end, and I hope I'm not going to cry right now. So they're my supervisors, of course, Jamie Piddock, Mark Howden, and Coco Warner, who's hopefully watching us from far away Germany right now. There's my family back home. Yeah, I knew that would happen. Yeah, the Fenner cohort and everybody just who supported me in this journey. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. And a special thank you also to all of the people that took part in my research and gave up their time to talk to me and were my interviewees. Without you, that would have never been possible. Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Well, fantastic.
Yes.
So I would like to field a series of questions. If anybody would like to pose a question for Mel, they can do that in the Q&A function there. There is a massive crowd of around 70 attendees who have watched.
Oh, great. And I've just cried in front of all of them.
Indeed. Before I pass over to questions, just want to thank Co-Supervisor Mark Howden. Mark, did you want to say any words?
Oh, just what a fantastic job you've done there, Mel, and venturing into uncharted territory and
thank you,
and pulling a huge amount of stuff together.
Excellent. We have the questions flooding in. So
oh dear.
Start. So first one from Anonymous is, using the polluter pays principle is good in theory, but how would you apply it in practice when the impacts are coming from diffuse things like cyclones or ocean acidification?
How to apply, sorry, how to apply it to ocean acidification.
So how would you apply the user pays principle in practice when the impacts are coming from diffuse things like ocean acidifications
Right.
that might be hard to assign culpability?
So yeah, from the results, it wasn't necessarily that practitioners said we should apply to ocean acidification. It was more about applying it in order to mobilize funds and then address things like ocean acidification. So the polluter pays principle itself should be used in its traditional sense and applied to major polluters through, may it be a carbon tax or current emissions or emissions trading scheme. So it wasn't, it's not supposed to be applied to a particular impact, but to raise or mobilize the funds from a country in order to then address an impact.
Fantastic, thanks. We've got another question that's come in here from Gonzaga Powers. What is your definition of the small island nations? Is it based on population or geographical size? And how would you prioritise the allocation of funds?
So small island developing states, I'm looking at the definition under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the distribution of funds. So it's an interesting question. I've also asked in my interviews what should be funded in the first place. So what's a priority? And some of the interviewees mentioned that we need to look at it in certain contexts. So for some islands that might be more adaptation or resilience building, and for others that might be looking at human mobility or planned relocation projects. So from an interview point of view, the responses were about context dependency.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'd welcome more questions to come in now on the chat line. I believe that you can raise your hand, and if you do so, Peter O'Rourke can allow you to come in and ask a question. So further questions would be welcome now, either on the chat line or by raising your hand. So Mel, this is really pretty impressive PhD thesis in that you have so many published papers and papers under review. So where are they up to now in terms of acceptance?
Am I allowed to say that?
Well, just
yeah. So we have, I think I've indicated in some of my chapters. So the chapter on insurance is already published with climate policy. Then the chapter on planned relocation and the spectrum from loss and damage and adaptation is published in a book series by Springer on managing climate change adaptation in the Pacific. The following chapter that follows on from that was published as part of a conference that was held after the publication of the book. Then the chapter on slow onset events and philanthropic organization was published this year, which was a special issue that was commissioned by the UNFCCC. So that is brand new. I highly recommend having a look at that if you're interested in looking at how we can address slow onset events. There's also another one that is on finance, so highly recommended. Then I have the paper in which I developed the application forms for including loss and damage in the Green Climate Fund. And I'm not sure whether, if anyone has questions on that, I'm not sure whether that actually came through quite clearly. I had a little bit of issues with my computer here. So yay, online presentations. So if there are any questions, please ask me. So that is currently under review, submitted to climate policy. And then two other chapters, my chapter on Dominica and Barbuda is submitted to international development. Yeah, climate and development. Yeah.
Widely available very soon.
Yeah.
and my question has brought in the requisite flood of questions. So let me see if we can move through them very promptly. So we've got
Okay.
8 new questions. So from
We
Roger.
still have a bit of time. So
Do. Great work, says Roger. Although
thanks,
you do
Roger.
at quantification, have you thought about the use of full cost accounting as a way of identifying funds which can be gathered through the pricing mechanism of polluters?
I have not, no, because, so very clear. No, I have not looked into that. Definitely something that we should look into. But like I said, that my thesis really was about being pragmatic to overcome the political nature of the topic, and to get through those hurdles and make it happen for people, rather than waiting for projections or attribution science to tell me exactly how much loss and damage is now because of climate change, how much a hurricane is attributable to climate change.
Thanks. We've got one from Jack Pezzi, and Peter O'Rourke. I'll just ask you to find a way of unmuting Jack. But while we're waiting for that to happen, I'll just repeat Richie Marfu's question. Great presentation, Mel, and congratulations. I have one question. The application that you developed to include loss and damage in the GCF, did it yield the result that you expected for your paper you mentioned that is still in review? Does it also apply directly for slow onset events, extreme events, or loss and damage in general?
Yes, very interesting question. Thank you, Richie. So it does work. I analyzed the governance instrument, and from a legal perspective, you can include loss and damage in one of those thematic funding windows, and then adjusted one of the major eligibility criteria for adaptation and mitigation to fit a loss and damage in there. So I wrote down those eligibility criteria, and simply then looked at the European Solidarity Fund, and payments are actually made on a GDP loss. And there's also room for slow onset events as well as non-economic losses. And it actually has a compensatory character without actually being compensation. So you're simply acknowledging that someone suffers severe hardship and that assistance is required. And then I have used the developed selection criteria and used the post-disaster needs assessment of the destruction of Hurricane Dorian from the Bahamas, and basically inserted all the figures and calculated how much based on the calculation and the payout features of the Solidarity Fund. Basically wrote that application and calculated the payments that the Bahamas would have received. Yeah, so it worked out. It works.
Excellent. Good to know it works. And here is Jack Pezzi with another question.
Okay. Can you hear me, Mel?
I can. Loud and clear,
Great.
Jack.
Hey, it works. Good. Mel, I just it's both a sort of mixture of comment and question about the polluter pays principle and attribution, which is, as the comment is, I think it's really quite important to say, whenever you're mentioning the polluter pays principle, that point you did in clarification, but only in answer to the question, that it basically affects the source of the funds rather than trying to hold individual polluters responsible for any particular events. So that's just clarification. But I guess I have sort of two separate questions about the PPP and attribution. I mean, the polluter pays principle question basically is, do the major polluters accept this? Is this just a proposal, or is there any kind of acceptance that they should contribute extra funding because of loss and damage? And they're sort of related, I guess these are kind of international political or bureaucratic questions, institutional questions, is, does attribution matter at all, in the sense that, supposing you have a hurricane in the Caribbean, does it make any difference to the source of any funding for loss and damage as to whether there is any kind of attribution of that hurricane to climate change?
Yes, thank you. So I'm just going to respond to the last question first.
Okay.
Because you need to repeat the first part of it.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Didn't have anything to write down. So attribution is, there is always the question about how much, like very simply put, how much of a hurricane is actually attributable to anthropogenic climate change, and we don't. Their methods are improving, but we don't really know. And that is a question in terms of finance. If someone says, I want to have money for that, the question always is, yeah, but I can't give you 100% for all the destruction that the hurricane has caused, because we always had hurricanes in the Caribbean, and we always had tropical cyclones in the Pacific. So there is that question about the payments that are being made. So attribution science and the question of how much of a natural disaster or weather-related natural disaster is actually loss and damage. So it is important to, like I did in my thesis, to overcome that question, to make sure that we don't even have to ask that question, that we can go beyond that and just yeah. And well, I think that
I guess I just wonder, I mean, can you always go beyond that question? I mean, aren't various providers of the funds going to query that? Or, I mean, simply, does it affect which fund it comes from?
Yeah, so if we look at like I said, the European Solidarity Fund, there's actually payments made based on GDP loss from that disaster. So if, depending on the loss of GDP or depending on the severity of and that's what I said, I've made calculations and put the thresholds in there. Depending on that, a payment would be made. So that means the payment rises with the severity of the natural disaster. So if it's not as severe, then you wouldn't get as much as a high payout. But the worse it gets, the assumption is it is related to climate change. And that is loss and damage.
Okay, well, I mean, to go back to the first part of the question and to link it there, I'm sort of wondering, well, to what extent is this just, no, it sounds critical, but I'm just trying to work out to what extent does this differ from just an enhanced disaster payment fund in ways that, you know, really specifically linked to climate. And the first part of the question was, to what extent do the major polluters, China, Europe, America, accept the polluters pays principle and therefore will be paying extra money that they wouldn't have otherwise been paying into various funds?
So, like I said, the polluters pays principle is actually brought forward by over 43 interviewees. So they actually said that we need to work somehow with the polluter pays principle. Yeah, so I guess that this basically shows that there is agreement on applying that polluter pays principle. But like I said, with further research, we also need to figure out how that looks in practice. And I think with the negotiations of Article 6 and the established mechanism in the Paris Agreement, there will be discussion around how and what that mechanism is going to look like. And looking at the responses, maybe the polluter pays principle will come into play again in some way. It could be we're talking emission trading schemes, carbon tax, major polluters tax, bunker fuel, passenger airline levies. All of these things are on the table. Whether they will then be used for loss and damage, or whether we say, look, actually we need to look at mitigation, so we don't really provide any funds for loss and damage, that's a different question. Yeah, so, but I don't, yeah, that's not what I'm intended to answer, or it's not possible for me to answer with the data that I collected.
Sure. Anyway, I wish you luck. I was just wondering how many of your interviews have the power to influence the major polluters.
Well, I guess in a way, you know, I've told people now that you actually agree on things, so maybe get on with the job.
Okay. So we have 9 minutes of our allotted time left and a number of questions. What I'm going to do is run up to the allotted time with questions, say some fond words, and then those who wish to continue can sally forth. continue on. So we'll go to an online question first and then come to Tony Weir live. So the next online question is from Mariah Meow, and it's just disappeared off my screen, which is most inconvenient. Here we go. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting to see the association between loss and damage and non-economic loss. And actually, it's not so much of a question as a statement. I'll take that as a comment.
Okay.
Read it online. It goes on to say, would like to see whether there's a lot of research out there on the impacts in the area of health for the Pacific, especially in terms of the impacts of climate change on water quality, which influences waterborne and water-related diseases. Mm. So, very good comment.
Yeah, maybe I can comment quickly back, Maria. Thank you. I think I don't do or didn't do a lot of research into health in particular as a non-economic loss, but I think the research is increasing, but I don't think that it is enough yet. So we don't necessarily have a big understanding yet of the health impacts of loss and damage on communities. So I think it's definitely something that we need to look into further. Yeah.
Thanks for the comment. I might hand over to Tony Weir. Tony, for a very concise question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just wanted to say congratulations.
Thank you.
And there's an awful lot of work in there, some of which I was hoping to have caught up with earlier, but I didn't. And yeah, I'm a bit with Jack Petsy on, you know, you say there's agreement. Well, it's agreement among the interviewees, but it remains to be seen, for example, in Glasgow, how far that agreement carries into the corridors of power, shall we say.
Yeah, I guess that is true. And we also have to say that we're talking to practitioners. I haven't talked to ministers. So we also know that negotiators go with a mandate that comes, that is probably already politically charged and can only act within that mandate. So yes, it remains to be seen how that is actually going to pan out in Glasgow this year, with the added complication of the pandemic and potentially not everybody being at the negotiating table. Yeah.
Will you in fact be going to look at Glasgow?
If someone lets me out of the country, I'm going to go.
So I guess it'll be a remote look.
So if anyone's watching who is in power, I'm going to go.
We have a most powerful audience, but I'm not sure that there's any ministers watching who will sign your departure approval.
Probably not, no.
Okay, our next question online, a great question from Anonymous. You mentioned that a gender-sensitive approach would be beneficial.
Yep.
And could reduce loss and damages. I'm curious as to how exactly this would work.
Yeah, so very interesting. Also, one of the so-called innovative or unexpected responses from my global data set. So if we have women that are made less reliant on men, they would, for example, have access to more information services when it comes to early warning systems, for example. They are able to get shelter before that. They don't have to wait until the husband comes home, for example. Or we would be able to, women are knowledge holders of households. They know the needs of the family. And they know where we need to adjust things in order to make it easier to leave the house. Or so there are many different ways that a gender sensitive approach would be beneficial to reduce loss and damage in the first place. And we need to consider that often, most of the time, women are carers for elderly people or vulnerable people with disabilities. So that makes them even more vulnerable because they not just have to look after themselves, but they also have to make sure that their children and other family members are safe as well.
Fantastic, thanks. There's a lot of appreciation and love on this chat line. You should open the box and have a look and soak it all in after.
I'm glad I can't see it.
Let me go to the next question then, from Michael Wellington. It is difficult to get potential funders to recognise and understand non-economic losses. How can that concept be effectively communicated to garner support?
I think I tried to do that a little bit with the chapter I developed, so that we look at it in first of all as a combination. I think that for me was a really striking result, that we need to look at them as inherently connected, so that we can reduce non-economic losses in the first place, so that they don't even that an economic impact doesn't result in a non-economic impact, such as mental health or depression or stressing out, and how people describe that to me. And then we also had the respondents actually saying how they would like to see it addressed. So there needs to be a swift recovery. So swift recovery and going back to normal as quickly as possible. So that is something that we need to focus on. And programs that are there longer term. So the emphasis was really on longer term and not just in there for 2 months and then going back out. So I think these are some of the things that I tried to clarify in that chapter to make them more tangible. But I think it is still a challenge to explain that to practitioners or other people as well. As you can see, the responses were even coming back ambiguous and quite, yeah.
Excellent.
I hope that answered the question a little bit.
Yeah, we're nearing the end of the allotted hour and there's still half a dozen cracking questions here. My suggestion is we do a little wrap up, but then continue on with those remaining questions. Mel and
yeah,
Peter.
I'm just searching my sorry, yeah.
Yeah, if you have the time to continue on, we could do so.
Yeah, we can do a few more. I'm not going anywhere here in lockdown.
So for those of you online, thank you so much for your joining this seminar. It's one of the biggest and most enthusiastic PhD seminar crowds that I have seen, and please join me in congratulating Mel on 4 excellent years of PhD research, many papers, and a thesis that hopefully will truly influence international policy.
I hope so too. There's definitely some practical stuff in there that can be used. So it was meant to be something that can actually be used in the real world. So I hope people pick that up. I just put the first slide on again. If you want to get in touch, please do so and send me an email if there are more questions, or just wanted to have a chat. Please do not hesitate to get in touch.
And thank you to the FENA team, particularly Peter O'Rourke, for supporting this seminar.
Yes, thank you, Pete.
With that, we'll close the formal session and invite anybody who has to run away to head off. But we might continue on with the remaining questions, Mel, if you're up for this.
Yeah, let's do another 5 to 10 minutes.
Excellent. Are you able to access the Q&A function, or would you like me to keep reading them out?
I don't think I can. Why don't you just keep
That's all right. Let me read them out then. So from Ben Day, thanks Mel, great job. What would you highlight as the single biggest challenge to realising the funding proposal you have outlined today and in your 2021 paper? Thank you.
Oh, the single biggest challenge on how to make this possible. Well, I hope that someone is going to read my PhD and thinks this is amazing and then takes it to Glasgow. So that is a challenge. I hope also with this seminar that I was able to disseminate the information that I gathered. And I hope that, I really hope that someone is going to pick it up and take it somewhere big. And yeah. It is, that's the single biggest challenge, someone really making use of it. And I think that's the case for a lot of fantastic, great PhD thesis. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So autograph copies to Joe, Boris and President Xi. And
Yep, on their way.
Next one from Claudia. Thanks for this clear and brilliant presentation of your work, Melanie. My question is, if your proposed model for finance contemplates different governance models, for example, customary land at local level, or is it assumed that nations will redistribute it with local communities? And in brackets, congratulations, great work.
Okay, what's the question?
Will your proposed model for finance contemplate different governance models? For example, I think it's funding customary land management at local levels.
Yes, so thanks, Claudia. Thanks for your comment. Yeah, so the spectrum actually from that I talked about, from loss and damage to adaptation, does look at context dependency and the need for taking customary land ownership and private land ownership into consideration. And that was also something that came out of the interviews with, especially with Barbudans, because there is a different type of land ownership structure in Antigua as from Barbuda, and we need to, that was another way of addressing problems with these ownership models, that you, when you address non-economic impacts, that this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. So let's say, for example, if this financial mechanism was working and someone handed in an application for a planned relocation process, then this application would need to include the recognition of customary land ownership. Does that, I hope that answers that.
Excellent. I'm sure Claudia can follow up with you as required. We've got from Gonzaga, thank you and congratulations. And from Hong, awesome presentation, really well done, congrats. And then from the good Professor Steve Cork, I'll wave at him from across the street. Is there a concern eventually countries might reduce their investments in adaptation because they expect to receive payments for loss and damage? The moral question.
Yes, that is a very, very good question. And I think from a personal point of view, I guess it is a possibility, but then from a moral point of view, I hope this is not going to happen, because it means that we're putting people's lives at danger. So if we go into that area of compensation, and if compensation payments are to be made, then maybe that, it is a possibility, but I wouldn't dare to say whether that's actually going to happen or not. Yeah. Oh, actually, now that I remember that in the application forms or the eligibility criteria for solidarity payments in my chapter 3, one of the criteria in order to be eligible for payments is proving that you have done everything possible to adapt to the hazards that your country is exposed to. So if you fail to implement the most obvious adaptation or disaster risk reduction measures, that would disqualify you from solidarity payments from that solidarity fund.
Excellent, thanks. So there's a whole lot of questions from anonymous attendee who I don't think is still online, so we might leave those. We've got a number of congratulatory comments.
Thank you.
Great body of work and presentation. A thank you again from Mariah. From Deppy, awesome work, Mel, congratulations. From Saul Cunningham, thanks, Mel, great job.
Thanks, Saul.
Also from anonymous attendee, amazing presentation. There is a question here, Peter O'Rourke, basically about this recording of this presentation and where would that be available? Could you just let people know?
Sure. So we'll put this up on our website, which is fennerschool.edu.anu. fennerschool.anu.edu.au under videos, but we'll also put it up on our YouTube page as well. But I might also post a link in the event itself. So if you search, past events, you should be able to find it there as well. So we'll put it in 3 places.
Fantastic. So if you Google Fenner School YouTube, you'll find it, or Fenner School videos on our ANU website. You'll find it.
Or yeah, send me an email and I send it to you when it's online.
Excellent. And there's a final comment here from Tom Worthington. Well done, but how do we applaud? You have done a splendid job simply by this excellent comments.
One's just come in from Chris Bell.
Chris Bell, yes.
Need to submit my question anonymously, so there you go.
Okay, congratulations on your work and presentation. However, I do think to take your work to the biggest somewhere, I think at COP26, for example, you need to apply your macroeconomics background and not just focus on microeconomic efficiency.
Okay.
Economic approach is not going to get us to less than 2 degrees global warming.
I take that as a comment. Was it a question?
I think it was a comment.
Okay, all right.
And some valuable feedback there. With that, I am at the Q&A chat line. Are there any final words of wisdom you'd like to impart, Mel?
I'm just really thankful that I was able to go through this journey, and that I had the support of you, Jamie and Mark, and also Coco, who is possibly at the other end of the world watching. Yeah, I'm really grateful for every minute. Also the field work that I was able to do, the support I received through the institute for climate, energy and disaster solutions that Mark Howden is the director of. Yeah, I hope that this will help. My PhD is actually going somewhere. I really do believe that some of the results there are really helpful and useful. I hope that they will be published soon, so that it is accessible to practitioners and people out there. I'm grateful for everybody who talked to me, who gave me information, who just guided me. And so I can't believe that it's coming to an end. So I have to find a real job now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Also, thank you for the questions and for the congratulations. And thanks so much.
Congratulations. Thanks, everybody. See you at another Zoom call sometime soon.
Yeah, definitely. Bye.